the patient is conscious, cooperative, oriented, and the pulse, you have to describe the pulse, respiratory rate, whatever temperature, whatever you have the facility. But then you have to understand certain things like general habitus, facies, and posture. Like if the patient is having typically thin inverted champagne legs, so this happens in Charcot-Marie-Tooth disease. So they are very typical. So if you see those legs, you will never forget it. So similarly, there are other body habitus also which are there. And facies, the patient may have some facies like mucopolysaccharidosis and other glycogen storage disorders. They usually present with pediatric deformities, spinal and extraspinal also. So they have typical faces. Even Marfan's, you will see a high arch palate. So all these things you have to keep in mind when you are doing a general examination. Then again, dilated veins, if you have portwine spots, they may suggest some arteriovenous malformation. Eyes, especially cornea, if the cornea is cloudy and the patient is having multiple limb deformities or spinal deformities, you should consider a mucopolysaccharidosis. One patient, you may get a neurofibromatosis patient as a spot case or something in the exam, and they may ask you about Lisch nodules. So Lisch nodules are basically seen as they are hematomous nodules which are seen as a yellow brown on outer surface of iris. But to see them, you need a slit lamp. So you should not get into that error of saying that, okay, eyes are showing Lisch nodules, because to see them and differentiate them properly, you need a slit lamp examination. So as I said, high arch palate can be seen in Marfan, so and other collagen disorders. So you need to keep that into consideration. And movements, lymph nodes. So if you have a patient of a thoracic Cox and you do not comment on the neck nodes or something, these are all the brownie points. The examiner may not mind that you have not commented on the neck nodes, but if you comment on if they have a neck node and you comment on that, so you get extra brownie points which add to your marks once you have passed. So in the general physical examination, you can also check for the hands and arms. So normally we call as the vertical and horizontal span. So vertical span is the height of the patient, and horizontal span is the difference from the tip of the middle finger to the tip of the middle finger of the other hand. So normally they both are equal, but if you have a patient whose upper limbs are longer than the lower limbs, it can happen in Marfan syndrome or even some other collagen vascular disorders. Then typically you have very long spider fingers. That is what is they called. So they are also there in collagen vascular disorders. And you should check the flexibility. So normally a patient cannot touch the back of his thumb to the forearm. So, but in Marfan's and all, you can see that they can easily bend their thumb towards the and touch the dorsum of the forearm. In chest, you need to comment on deformity, chest expansion, which is very essential, especially in ankylosing spondylitis. The chest expansion is restricted to less than 2.5 centimeters. Chest expansion is always measured at the level of nipples, and you ask the inspire and then full inspiration and then expiration. So the difference should be it should be around 5 centimeters ideally. But if it is less than 2.5, it means that it is severely restricted. If you get a case who has got, say, a collagen vascular disorder, then you may have some murmurs also. You may or may not know about them, but it is always better to keep in mind that there may be some murmurs over there. So per abdomen examination, if you get a patient with flank pain or the back pain, and patient is on anticoagulation and he suddenly develops severe pain and weakness, numbness in the legs, pain, so you have to consider a hematoma in the lumbar plexus. So this flank ecchymosis is sort of a sign for a sort of a bleeding inside the plexus. So if you do a MRI of the spine, you will not get anything. But if you look carefully in the paravertebral lesion, then you will get the sort of findings. And in legs, deformity, wasting, they will all give you signs of whether they are acute onset illnesses or there are long onset illnesses, means for a very long time. Genitalia should be examined, and rectal examination will be essential when the patient has a neurological deficit. Otherwise, the examiner may not ask too much about the rectal examination if the patient's neurology is okay and he does not have any other bowel bladder problem. So let's see when the examination begins. So we can see the first thing you can see, if the patient is walking, then you can check the gait, because then you don't need to sort of ask the patient to get up, sort of sit again, stand up and then do it. So if the patient is walking towards you, you can check the gait at that time only. The way the patient sits, the way the patient gets up will give you a fair idea of how much the pain status actually is of the patient. So whenever you inspect from the front, you inspect from the back, and you inspect from the side. If the patient is not able to get up from the bed, so you mention that I have examined the patient in the lying down position in the bed because the patient is unable to sit because of the pain. So you look for any deformity, you look for knuckle kyphosis, you look for tenderness in the palpation and palpate the examination point. So the main gait patterns, what you can see are these ones. So you have a Trendelenburg gait. So Trendelenburg gait, you all know, is a very common gait, but how does it come in spine? Because L5 root also supplies the hip abductor muscle. So if the hip abductor muscle is weak, it sort of gives a lurch, or this thing, a bend towards one side. So the patient sways towards the side of the weakness, and he tries to compensate it by bending towards the other side, because he tries to shift the weight of the patient towards the weight of his trunk towards the other side, so that it doesn't fall on the same side. The other is the scissoring gait or the spastic gait, and this type of gait is seen in deficits, or this type of gait may be seen in myelopathy patients. In cerebral palsy patients who have severe spasticity, you can see that it may be sometimes very difficult or impossible to open the sort of split the legs of the patient, and this also creates a huge problem in perineal and private part hygiene. If you have a patient of a foot drop, so foot drop, the patient will have a high stepping gait, because again the foot dorsiflexors become weak. So in order to clear from the ground, he has to lift his leg more so that he can walk, and then they walk with a slapping type of a gait, because there is no dorsiflexion control. So when it falls, it just falls like this on the ground. So you may have festinant gait. Festinant gait is characteristic of Parkinson. So not very related to orthopedics, but you should be able to differentiate a patient of festinant gait from any other gait abnormality to fall in the trap that this patient may have. So if you have a Parkinson patient who is there and he is not able to walk properly, you can say that the gait cannot be fully assessed because the patient has Parkinsonism and he is not able to cooperate fully for the gait assessment. And short limb gait is again essential. So when the patient is walking with a short limb gait, his ipsilateral shoulder will be sort of getting and dipping towards one side. So he will be dipping towards the same side where the limb is gait, and this also can give rise to a compensatory scoliosis. So if your right leg is short, supposedly these are the two legs, this is short, so the pelvis will tilt. In order to remain straight, the spine will develop a scoliosis so that you stand erect. So you can get a curve on the right side. And if you have upper lumbar radiculopathy and your knee is weak, then you may have a buckling gait. So the patient's knee tends to sort of buckle whenever he walks. So whenever you examine the patient, you sort of also make him bend forward. So that also clears a lot of things. And this is also called as Adams test. So Adams test is something which when you bend forward, so you can see the hump and this thing very clearly. And when you see the patient, try to start from one end. So from one end, you start from head, go down to the neck, go to the shoulder, see the central furrow, see the rib hump, see the waist creases, see the level of pelvis, and then you see the legs, comment on leg length, see if patient is trying to bend one knee to compensate for any leg length discrepancy or for any scoliotic severe pelvic tilt or something. So in this patient, if you see, you can say that the head is central, but the right shoulder is slightly higher than the left one. You can see that there is a hump on the thoracic spine. There are asymmetric waist creases. So this crease is here and this crease is here. So they are asymmetric waist creases. You can see that the arm and trunk difference is quite distant here, whereas this is touching. So which means that the patient has swayed toward this side, and the leg length seems fairly equal. From the side, you can comment on curvature, lordosis, and kyphosis. And sometimes even excessive lordosis in younger age may be a sign of listhesis. So the patients who have spondylolisthesis grade 3, grade 4, they have a very hyperlordosis to compensate uh, for the slip of the vertebra which is there. And you have to know these terms. Kyphosis, it is sort of three types, like it is categorized. One is called as a knuckle, what is called as a gibbous, and one is called as otherwise kyphosis. So the knuckle means that there is only one vertebra which forms the apex of the curve. So this happens usually in, say, a TB or a fracture or something. Then there is a gibbous where 2-3 vertebra are involved. So you get a slightly curved, sort of very angular, but you can palpate 2-3 spinous processes in between. And third is a kyphosis, when there is a gross deformation. It can be a round kyphosis like you have in a Shorman or in an osteoporotic, or you can even have a severe angular kyphosis which can be seen. Now this is what is called as a Adams test. So when you ask the patient to bend forward, you can see the hump very clearly. So this is what is called as Adams test. And you should also see any list. A list means the patient's shoulders or the head are not centered over the pelvis, they are tilted towards one side. So list can happen in scoliosis, and list can happen in PIDs also. So it is a protective mechanism to sort of compensate for the loss of nerve space. So they try to keep the nerve adjusted. So you also comment on any swellings. You have to know, sort of visually analyze the sinus parts or tracts which may be there. Comment on the skin, and you have to know this. These are the things which are called as cafe au lait spots. So these cafe au lait spots are classical of neurofibromatosis. They may be there in other conditions also, but they have a sort of a tendency to be found in neurofibromatosis. And very essential that if the patient is dark skinned, you cannot see cafe au lait spots. So to see the spots of this color, you need to have this color of skin. So dark skinned cannot be assessed for a cafe au lait spots. And in prepubertal, they have to be greater than 5 mm, and in postpubertal they have to be greater than 15 mm. And if you have 6 of these spots, then you consider them as a diagnostic criteria for neurofibromatosis. Of course, you have to have other signs like axillary or inguinal freckling, or you need to have neurofibromas, you need to have a plexiform neurofibroma, first degree relative, all are these. But cafe au lait spots, for definition, you should know these terms and you should know the limitations. If you see a patient with such a spine and with a hairy patch and something like this, so this is spinal dysraphism. This may be just a spina bifida occulta, wherein just there is a failure of closure of spinous process, whereas in other cases it may have serious complications, like it may have a dermoid cyst, or it may have a tethered cord and other. So this tuft of hair at the lower end, especially in a child who has a foot asymmetry, or you see a child of a, say, you say diagnose it that a child has got CTV, or it's got a foot deformity, and when you examine the spine of the child, he has got a tuft of hair. So you have to consider a neurological cause also. You should not get confused these tuft of hair or these with these Mongolian blue spots. So they are congenital dermal melanosis. They are benign and usually they disappear also. But these are not. You need to understand the difference between neurofibromatosis, such a tuft of hair, and versus these Mongolian blue spots. So whenever you see from the side, you will be able to differentiate. You always ask the patient to bend forward when you're examining from behind. You always ask the patient to bend forward when you're examining from the side. So this is what you call as a round kyphus. This is a Shorman's kyphus, which is round and huge. And this is an angular kyphus. You can see that this is quite angulated and pointed. So this is a post TB kyphosis. This is a Shorman's kyphosis. So this is the difference between angular and this is the round kyphosis. So for palpation, whenever you say the temperature, tenderness and all, but before you palpate the patient's spine, it is always nice to sort of run your hand all the way into the median furrow of the spine, because that way the patient, you may understand that which is the painful part of the patient. If you directly try to press, you may end up at a part where patient is having severe pain and the patient gets upset with you that you touched a part and it's caused severe pain. So that also prepares them that doctor is going to see you when you run your hand like that. So you confirm the inspection findings. If you have marked, you have to mark the bony points. You mark the level of shoulder, you mark the spine, you mark the posterior superior iliac crest, and then if you have to do any measurements, you can do with them. You drop a plumb line. So you hold a plumb line at C7, like if you have a plumb line, you can hold it here and then see that this is not falling through the center of the pelvis. So this is tilted towards one side. The child has a list, which also can be seen by the trunk arm distance. Asymmetric trunk arm distance is a sign of list. And you need to examine all the abscess points. You need to know them, the lumbar, the inguinal, the chest, intercostal, all of these you need to find. So always do a lower limb length assessment before you comment on any spinal deformity, because you need to know the true and the apparent measurements of the legs to understand that is it a true deformity or is it a secondary to a lower limb length discrepancy. So if you otherwise have got a case where in the lower length there is a discrepancy of lower limb and you make the patient stand, then you can sort of again comment that if you find that there is a bit of scoliosis which is happening, to compensate. So again, this is a brownie point sort of thing that you can get better marks or better this thing with the same examiner. So flexion, there are a lot of ways to test tip to floor distance, tip to mid tibia distance, but the most important one is the what we call as the Schober's test. So what was Schober's test and what is modified Schober's test? So Schober's test was a test which was devised that you palpate and find out the spinous process of L5. Then at that L5 below 5 centimeters, you mark a point, and then above 10 centimeters, you mark a point. And then you ask the patient to bend forward. But there was a problem that if the examiner did not palpate the L5 spinous process right, or say it was absent, like in a bifida occulta, then you would see at L4 and you may mark a point which may not tell you the lumbosacral junction ka moment. So now modified Schober's test, you mark the center point between the two posterior superior iliac spines, which comes at the S2 level. So this thing of having a error between L5 S1 gets washed off, and you mark the 2 points PSIS, and then you mark the center of the spine, and that is your starting point. And then you mark a second point above 50 to 15 centimeters above that point. So you ask the patient to bend forward, and if the excursion is less than 5 centimeter, you consider it significant. So extension and all, you can again check with the average range, but rotation, it is very essential that if you're checking rotations, you cannot check the rotation in the standing position. You need to stabilize the pelvis, otherwise you will not be able to know how much is the dorsal rotation. The lower limb rotation will add to it. So whenever you check for the spinal rotation, you have to make the patient sit. Without sitting, you cannot check. Or if you're making stand, then you need to stabilize the pelvis with both hands. Maybe possible in a child, but in adult, it is very difficult. So then there are certain special tests which we sort of do to check for the lower limb radiculopathy or upper limb radiculopathy. So they also part a form of the spinal examination, or a part of the spinal examination. So one is the straight leg raise test. So what is a straight leg raise test? So in a straight leg raise test, what you do is you make the patient flat, lie down on a couch. Your one hand should be on the knee, supporting and pushing it to make the knee straight. And then with your other hand placed just above ankle, you try to straighten this leg. And at the degree where the patient complains of pain, you measure that angle between posterior of thigh and the couch, and that is what you call as straight leg raising test. So there are various ranges which are described between that. So they say less than 30, more than 30 to 70, and more than 70. So more than 70 is usually considered normal. 30 to 70 is sort of a gray zone, may have, may not have, it may be a hamstring tightness. And less than 30 is usually considered as diagnostic of prolapsed intervertebral disc. Now you also have something which is called as a crossed SLR, or the cross straight leg raise test. It means that when you lift right leg of the patient and patient complains of pain, he also complains of pain in the left leg. Now understand this, very essential, that crossed SLR is more specific. That means that if you have a patient who has a crossed SLR positive, then the chances that he will not have a disc are very, very less. So straight leg raise can be positive in a lot of things, but a crossed SLR, if it is positive, it means that this patient most likely has a disc and not sort of does not have any other thing, like any other masquerading or a diverting factor. But again, its sensitivity is low. So then there are certain other tests which you should know by the name, which are called as Lessig's test, Fajr-Khan's and Bragard's test. So Lessig test basically means that if the patient has got severe leg pain, he will not be able to sort of manage and give you a true angle at which the leg is going to be raised to become positive. So the patient may have severe spasm. As soon as you raise the leg, he may start shouting and crying. So you can't do an SLR. So Lessig test was described to do the same. So in that, you do not straight away raise the leg. You bend the hip first and bring it to say 30 degrees, and then in those 30 degrees you slowly try to make the leg straight. So if the patient doesn't complain of pain, then you bend the knee again, you raise the thigh to again say 40 degrees or 50 degrees, and then slowly you start making the knee joint straight again or the leg straight again. So that is how you find out what is the true SLR. Then there are two more tests, which are the Fajr-Khan's and the Bragard tests. They are again provocative tests. So in one, what you do is that when the patient complains of pain, you sort of dorsiflex the foot at the same time. So when you dorsiflex the foot at the same time, the sciatic nerve gets stretched even more. So the patient complains of increase in pain. And in the other test, what you do is you sort of lower the leg at an angle. Supposedly the pain is coming at 50 degrees, you make it to 40 degrees, and then you dorsiflex the foot. So if the patient complains of reappearing pain, it is also diagnostic of a prolapse test or a nerve stress test. The other one is a bowstring test. So in bowstring test, what you do is you stand at the foot end of the patient. You don't stand on the side, you stand at the foot end of the patient. You sort of hold his leg up and sort of stabilize it at a point where the patient complains of pain, and then slightly get it down, and then you apply a pressure on the popliteal fossa. So when you apply the pressure on the popliteal fossa, it again presses the sciatic or the tibial nerve. So that stretches the sciatic nerve and causes pain. So this is called as bowstring test. So theoretically you should know all this, but the main examination your points are the SLR. So for understand that active SLR, which means that the patient is himself raising the leg, it can be positive in PID as well as in sacroiliac joint pathologies also. Whereas passive SLR, which is this, wherein the patient is lying down and the examiner is raising the leg, it is positive in PID, but not in SIJ test. So there are other special tests which are there for piriformis and other syndromes which you don't need to know for exam purpose. But sacroiliac joint examination you need to understand very clearly. So there are certain tests which are there. So one is the active SLR, which again is for sacroiliac pain. Then second is pelvic compression and distraction test. So you hold the two iliac bones and try to press them together, or you try to distract them. If the patient complains of pain, then it is called as the a positive sign for sacroiliac joint. Now this test is what you call as the Ganslin's test. So in this test, you bring the patient to the edge of the table so that half of his pelvis is hanging in the air. You flex the leg and you let the ipsilateral leg go down. So this way you are putting a rotating strain on the sacroiliac joint, and patient will complain of pain in the same joint. Now, the other test is a pump handle test, wherein you make this patient lie down straight, flat on the bed, and then you push the knee towards the opposite shoulder. So in this pump handle test, the patient complains of pain in the contralateral joint. So when you press this thing towards the shoulder, the patient will complain pain in the right sacroiliac joint. So this is what is called as the pump handle test. Now, there are other certain tests for cervical spine, which are to be differentiated for the cervical radiculopathy test. So these are the Adson's test. We will come to that in a bit, and other tests also. So understand that there can be sometimes Pancoast tumor, which means the infiltration of the pleural part of or the supraclavicular part of the pleura by tumor, which can also press on the nerves and cause a radiculopathy. So these Pancoast tumors, they need to be sort of, whenever you are looking at a cervical X-ray, also look at the angles, these upper supraclavicular fossae or the supraclavicular part of the lung. If you see such an opacity and the patient is having ipsilateral pain, it may be a Pancoast tumor. It may be a tumor which is pressing on the plexus. And when you do an MRI, it can clearly show you that this is a Pancoast tumor. There are two more tests which are done. These are done for cervical rib and these are done for or a abnormal anterior scalenus muscle. So they can give rise to a radiculopathy. So this test is the Addison's test, wherein you make the patient sit on a chair, abduct the shoulder to 30 degrees, and then slightly extend and pull back the arm, keeping your finger on the radial pulse. You palpate the radial pulse, then you ask the patient to turn towards one side, take a deep breath and hold. So if the patient's pulse goes away, it is a positive sign for thoracic outlet obstruction on the same side. Now, this one is called as the Allen's test. Now, in this, you make a 90-90 position, again, palpate the radial pulse, ask the patient to look towards opposite side, and then palpate the pulse. So if this goes away, this is also a positive sign for thoracic outlet. But there is a thing that whenever you do this test, you check for contralaterality, which means that if the pulse goes away in this hand and the patient has only complaint in this hand, if it goes away in this hand also, then it may be a possible that it is not the reason for his or her pain. The other test is also called as Roux test. So in that, what you do is you make the patient sit like this and ask him to slowly clench and open his fists sitting in this position. Do it for 3 minutes period. Normally patient will complain of pain, fatigue in shoulder and some sort of fatigue in fingers and forearms. But if the patient complains of same radicular pain, which is going down the arms, paresthesias, or there are visual signs that there is pallor in the nails, the hands have become less pink, then it can also be a sign for weak sort of compression in the thoracic spine. So whenever you have a C5-6 distribution, you need to differentiate it with the supraspinatus nerve compression. Again, the clinical signs we will need to discuss later on, because these are all very detailed specific investigation. So you need to consider all of these things whenever you are diagnosing a lower limb radiculopathy. Now, very briefly, I will go through the neurological examination. Now, neurological examination, whenever you start, whenever you have a spine patient and the neurology is normal, so your job is finished. So half of your examination goes away, that you have to just say that neurological examination is normal. If the examiner asks, then you come to the examination. But if the patient has a deficit, then you need to do a detailed neurological examination. So what are the main headings of the neurological examination? So higher functions, which means the brain function, that the patient is alert, conscious, is he able to understand, recognize everybody. Cranial nerves, if you have a upper cervical or a craniovertebral junctional problem, which it will not come to you in the undergraduate, means in the postgraduate level, then you need to examine the cranial nerves in detail. Gait, again, we have discussed. Posture comes in inspection. So now we are left with these three things, which are the motor, sensory, and reflexes. So in motor, you need to check for all these things. One is the bulk of the muscle. So all the muscle groups, what you're talking, you need to check the bulk. You need to check the thickness of the muscle with your hands. You need to measure the thigh, mid thigh and mid calf diameters also, and compare it with the other side. A discrepancy of more than 1 centimeter or 0.5 centimeter is significant. Tone is very essential. A patient who has got paraplegia, if the tone of the legs is very spastic, it means that the paraplegia is old. It is not of a few days or a few weeks, it is now months old. That is because tone takes time to develop. So power, whenever we say, we have a MRC grading for the power, which is called as grade 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So you need to know about these gradings. Grade 0 is that there is no power. Grade 1 means that there is just a flicker of contraction. Grade 2 means that the patient can move full range of motion in the joint, but with gravity eliminated, which means that if you ask the patient to raise the leg straight from the knee, he cannot do it. But if you place the patient on the side and then ask him to straighten the leg from folded position, he can straighten. It means it is 2, but he is not able to do anti-gravity, which is stage, which is the MRC grading 3. And grade 4 means that patient is able to do against some resistance, but there is some weakness there. And grade 5 is normal. And you need to check the reflexes, you need to check the coordination, any involuntary movements or any contractures. So reflexes, mostly we see the upper limb and we see the lower limb reflexes. So you need to know about the superficial as well as deep tendon reflexes. So superficial reflexes for you, it is the abdominal, cremastic and plantar. So abdominal, you can check, especially when you are marking the level of a thoracic paraplegia. So a patient, if somebody has a say a D9 or a D10 paraplegia, and you see the abdominal reflexes and all, and then you're doing a sensory examination, you may find that umbilicus, which corresponds to D10 level, below that there is no sensation, or the reflexes are also absent. So that is when you get a level of abdominal reflexes. And you have to understand that in myelopathy, superficial reflexes disappear and deep tendon reflexes become exaggerated. So abdominals below that may be gone. And cremasteric is a reflex which can be elicited in males. The root innervation is L1. So if you stroke the medial side of the thigh with a hammer or with a slight blunt object, you can see the ipsilateral scrotum being lifted up, which is because of the cremasteric muscle. And plantars, we are all aware about. Now let's come to the other reflexes. So biceps, the innervation is C5, C6, predominantly C5. So come down, supinator, it is C5, C6, predominantly C6. And there is something called as an inverse supinator jerk. So normally when you tap on the hammer, you can see that the arm is rising like this. But if you tap on the hammer and the patient's fingers are also doing this, so this is called as an inverse supinator jerk. So this happens in cervical myelopathy above C6 level. Triceps jerk again means the same. Hoffman is a sign like a plantar in the upper limbs. So if you see, if you sort of make the patient's hand relaxed like this, and then you nip the middle finger, terminal phalanx of the middle finger, you can see that the fingers and the thumb, they are sort of pinching like this. So this is called as Hoffman's reflex. And knee and ankle reflex you have to comment, and also you should know how to elicit the knee clonus and also the ankle clonus. Usually if the clonus is sustainable for 30 seconds, it's called a well sustained clonus. If it is less than, sort of it comes and then it does a flu this thing and goes away, it's called as a ill sustained clonus. Plantars also has a few variants which you should know by name at least. Babinski is the other name for plantar. There is a very fine difference between that, but for purpose of simplicity, you can keep it. Chedocks is that if you stroke the foot below the lateral malleolus from sort of from the heel towards the toe side, the patient gives an similar response to plantar. So this is called Chedocks. Oppenheim's means that you sort of heavily press upon the shin from the knee towards the ankle side. So that is called Oppenheim's, and Gordon's is pinching the tendocalcaneus. Now, these all signs, they usually Oppenheim's and Gordon's, if they are positive, it means that the paraplegia is of a long duration or the myelopathy is of a very long duration. Acute ones, you may get Babinski positive, but if you have these negative, it means that it is usually a recent onset upper motor neuron disease. And again, just for the sake of theoretical, you should be knowing that in the spinal cord, sensations mostly travel from posterior tracts and the lateral tracts. So lateral, you have a spinothalamic tract which carries the pain and temperature sensation. And posterior, you have a fasciculus gracilis and cuneatus which carry the fine touch, vibration, and joint position sense, what we call as JPS. So a few important things in that is that joint position sense and vibration, they are one of the earliest things to go away in diabetic neuropathy. And whenever you are examining or you have a Brown-Séquard syndrome where there is a hemitransaction of cord or a cord lesion involving the one half of the cord, what happens is that these lateral tracts, they cross, which means that if you have a pain which is coming from the right leg, and then that pain goes into the spinal cord and it crosses over to the other side and then it goes up. So it's a crossed track. Whereas this fasciculus gracilis and cuneatus, the fine touch and all these movements, they do not cross. They go straight away into the brain and then they cross at the level of above the medulla and at the midbrain level. They cross and somewhat over there. They do not cross immediately. So if you have a hemicord transaction, you may get a patient. Whenever you describe a Brown-Séquard syndrome, you have to say at the level of lesion and then below the level of lesion. So at the level of lesion, since the tracts enter from this side only, so both will be gone. So if you have a hemitransaction of cord at D10 level, so D10 level, If you have a hemi transaction on left side, so at left side, you will have loss of all sensations, pain, temperature, and everything, fine touch and everything. But below that level, which is D11 and below, you will have loss of pain sensation on the other side, which is on the right side, pain and temperature sensation on the right side, whereas loss of touch and fine touch vibration on the same side, ipsilateral side. That is what we call as a Brown-Sequard syndrome. You should all be very, very familiar with this ASIA chart, because this is something which may be asked in the exam theoretically or practically. If you get any patient with a neurodeficit, or you get a patient who is paraplegic, just go through these points. There are all things which are given, like these dots are the key points to check the sensations. If you start following this chart, if you do 10 patients, you will not need to remember anything. You will get everything in this chart. You will get innervation of C5, C6, C7, C8, T1. You will get sensation, light trick, light touch, and pinprick. Why we do pinprick and light touch? Because pinprick represents the lateral part of the cord and light touch represents the posterior part of the cord. So all of this is given in this one chart. So for neurological examination, you should always and always refer to this ASIA chart. And one more very important exam question related to ASIA chart is that ASIA A is absolute transaction, where there is no sensation, no movement, nothing below the level, and ASIA E is normal. So you label a patient ASIA E only if he has a cord injury, means if he had something, some cord injury at D10 level, he was ASIA C or D, and now he has completely recovered, you say that he's ASIA E. But if the patient does not have neurological deficit, then you do not apply this chart. Supposedly you have a patient who has got a fracture, and examiner asks you, what is the ASIA level of this patient? So you reply that, sir, in this case, since the neurology is normal, the ASIA level does not apply here. So we cannot do the ASIA charting in this patient. Thank you very much. If there are any questions, any one of you, we will encourage you to ask the questions.